What if the clearest sign of national development is not found in a presidential speech, a military parade, or a billion-dollar project, but in something as ordinary as finding a clean public toilet when you need one? In Ouagadougou, that question has become surprisingly real. For years, people passing through busy parts of the city could face a simple but deeply uncomfortable problem. When nature called, there was not always a clean and appropriate place nearby. Today, new public sanitation facilities are changing that experience for some residents. One local woman described the difference in the most practical terms. Before these facilities were available, finding somewhere to relieve herself could be difficult. Now she can enter a clean space where the basic necessities are provided. And one detail particularly caught her attention. Inside, there are mirrors, allowing women to check their appearance before returning to the street. It sounds small, but perhaps that is precisely why this story matters. Development is often discussed through economic growth, gold production, national sovereignty, foreign influence, and major infrastructure. Yet ordinary citizens experience a country differently. They experience it through roads they travel, water they can access, hospitals they can enter, public spaces they can use, and services that make everyday life a little safer and more dignified. These public toilets cannot prove that Burkina Faso has solved its enormous development challenges, nor can they, by themselves, prove the success of Captain Ibrahim Traore's political vision. But they give us something worth examining. Under Traore's government, Burkina Faso has increasingly emphasized national capacity, public infrastructure, citizen participation, and the idea that Burkinabe people should play a greater role in shaping their own future. So today, we are going beyond slogans and asking what that vision looks like from the ground. If you want to follow Africa through the changes ordinary people can actually see and experience, stay with this channel. Because sometimes a very small improvement can lead us toward a much bigger question. What does real sovereignty look like in everyday life? Before these public facilities appeared, the problem was easy to overlook unless you were the person suddenly searching for a toilet. In crowded areas of Ouagadougou, people could find themselves with nowhere appropriate to go. For an older person, a woman traveling with children, or someone with limited mobility, that inconvenience could quickly become something far more serious. A basic human need was being left without a basic public solution. The problem also reaches beyond personal discomfort. Burkina Faso continues to face major sanitation challenges, and access to improved sanitation remains limited across large parts of the country. Open defecation has not disappeared, particularly where appropriate facilities are unavailable. This means sanitation is not simply about appearance. It touches public health, cleanliness, privacy, and the dignity of people who should not have to search for an unsafe or exposed place to relieve themselves. That is why the experience described by residents in Ouagadougou matters. Their testimony begins with something almost everyone can understand. Before the new facilities, when the need suddenly arose, finding a suitable place could be difficult. There was no complicated political theory behind that frustration. People simply needed a service that was missing. For older citizens especially, this is an important way to think about infrastructure. A person in his 70s may not be able to walk several additional streets looking for a toilet. Someone living with a disability may need a facility that is accessible and maintained. Women need privacy and security. Good sanitation therefore becomes part of whether a city treats ordinary people with dignity. This is also where the meaning of development begins to change. National progress is often measured with numbers that most families never see directly. But people understand immediately when a daily difficulty disappears. They know when water becomes easier to obtain. They know when a road becomes safer. And they certainly know when a clean public toilet finally exists where one was needed. So before asking what Ibrahim Traore represents politically, there is a more fundamental question. If national sovereignty is supposed to give Burkina Faso greater control over its future, Should that control eventually be visible in the country's ability to solve basic problems for its own citizens? That is where this small sanitation story begins to connect with something much larger. The difference becomes clearest when we stop looking at the project from the government's point of view and listen to the people actually using it. One woman encountered during the assessment of the public toilets explained that before these facilities were available, finding somewhere appropriate to relieve herself could be difficult. After their installation, something that once caused stress became much easier. Her description was simple. The place was clean, useful, and properly arranged for the people entering it. Then she mentioned something that might seem almost insignificant in a discussion about national development. There were mirrors inside. For women using the facility, that meant they could check their appearance and compose themselves before stepping back outside. A mirror cost little compared with a highway, a hospital, or a power plant. Yet that small detail tells us something important about how people experience public infrastructure. They notice whether a place was designed merely to exist or designed with the user in mind. Another user, Mohamed Sawadogo, offered a similarly practical judgment. He described the facility as clean and good. For him, paying 50 CFA francs, roughly 9 cents in United States currency, was not enough to make the service unattractive. His reaction matters because it brings the discussion away from government announcements and back to a simple question. Does the service solve a real problem well enough that people are willing to use it? This is where development becomes visible. Economic growth figures matter. Gold production matters. National budgets matter. But most citizens do not wake up every morning and experience a percentage on an economic report. They experience whether water is available, whether streets are usable, whether healthcare can be reached, and whether public facilities are clean when they need them. None of this means that a clean toilet should be turned into a political monument. Burkina Faso still faces sanitation problems far larger than these individual facilities can solve. One satisfied user cannot represent an entire country, and one successful site cannot tell us whether every site is functioning equally well. But the lesson from the ground is still valuable. Development becomes meaningful when policy leaves the office and enters ordinary life. The next question, therefore, is whether these toilets are isolated improvements or part of something larger. To answer that, we have to move beyond one woman, one mirror, and one facility, and look at the system being built around them. Once we move beyond a single user and a single facility, the picture becomes more significant. These public toilets were not introduced as one isolated experiment on one street. In January 2025, public mobile sanitation facilities began operating in Ouagadougou. By September, report described 20 toilet complex across Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and Koudougou. That does not amount to a national sanitation transformation, but it does show an effort extending beyond one location. In Ouagadougou, 5 sites became part of the pilot effort, including locations near the Central Cemetery, the Monument of Peace, the Gungen Cemetery, the Jean-Pierre Guingane Cultural Center, and the municipal offices of District Number 3. These choices matter because public sanitation works best when facilities are placed, where people actually move, gather, work, and wait. A beautiful toilet built where nobody needs it solves very little. After roughly 8 months, officials returned to examine how the facilities were functioning. The important question was no longer whether Burkina Faso could install them. The question was whether they remained open, clean, useful, and accepted by the public. Officials reported satisfaction that the facilities they inspected were operating, while also acknowledging problems that still needed attention. This reveals 3 different levels of responsibility. The government and public agencies must create the infrastructure and establish the rules. Managers on the ground must clean the facilities, maintain them, collect fees where required, and deal with users every day. Then comes the public. Citizens decide whether to use the toilets properly, respect the facilities, and treat them as shared assets rather than somebody else's property. That distinction is important because development is not completed on inauguration day. Cutting a ribbon is easy to photograph. Maintaining a public service month after month is much harder. A toilet that becomes dirty, damaged, or unusable after a year is not the same achievement as one that continues serving thousands of people. And this is where the story becomes more demanding. Burkina Faso has not solved its sanitation challenge by installing 21 complexes. The scale of the national need remains much larger, but these facilities offer a useful test of something fundamental. Can a public investment become a dependable public service? The answer depends not only on construction, but on management, financing, maintenance, and the behavior of the people who use it. The next challenge begins with a number that seems almost too small to matter. Using these public toilets can cost 25 or 50 CFA francs, roughly 4 to 9 cents in United States currency. For some users, that is a reasonable price for a clean and maintained facility. For others, the principle of paying simply to relieve themselves is difficult to accept. That disagreement reveals one of the hardest questions behind any public service. Who pays to keep it working? At one site, the manager reported that weekend revenue could reach between 4,000 and 5,000 CFA francs per day, approximately 7 to 9 United States dollars. That money should not be mistaken for pure profit. A functioning toilet requires cleaning, water, supplies, maintenance, and people willing to manage the facility. Building the structure is only the beginning. Every day afterward creates another cost. Still, the objections from some residents should not simply be dismissed. In a country where many families live with limited incomes, even a small charge can matter when expenses accumulate. A public sanitation system therefore faces a delicate balance. It must remain affordable enough for ordinary people to use while generating or receiving enough support to remain clean and functional. There is another difficulty. Managers and officials have reported that some people still relieve themselves near walls, even when public toilets are available. Others resist paying, while vandalism and irresponsible behavior have also been reported. This demonstrates something that governments across Africa repeatedly confront. Infrastructure can be built faster than habits can change. That is why responsibility cannot stop with the government. Authorities must provide appropriate facilities and monitor their condition. Managers must keep them clean and usable, but citizens also have a role. A public toilet belongs to the community in a practical sense. Damaging it, refusing basic rules, or leaving it dirty simply transfers the cost back to everyone else. This may be the deeper lesson hidden inside a 50 CFA franc fee. National development is not only about what a government can construct, it is also about whether a society can maintain what has been created. Burkina Faso can install new facilities, but their long-term value would depend on management, affordability, public education, and civic responsibility. And that principle takes us directly toward Ibrahim Traore's larger message about citizens helping to build and protect the country they want to inherit. This is where Ibrahim Traore enters the story, but it is important to separate evidence from political mythology. There is no reliable evidence in the material we examined showing that Traore personally ordered or designed these specific public toilets. They were introduced under his government through Burkina Faso's Ministry of Environment, Water and Sanitation. Giving one man personal credit for every facility built by the state would oversimplify how government actually works. The more meaningful connection is found in the broader direction Traore has promoted. His government has repeatedly emphasized national capacity, public infrastructure, citizen participation, and greater reliance on Burkina Faso's own resources. One visible example is the Faso Mebo initiative, which has focused on urban development and road infrastructure. In 2025, Traore personally handed over hundreds of pieces of equipment intended to strengthen the country's capacity to carry out infrastructure work. That distinction matters. Sovereignty is easy to describe in political speeches, but much harder to build in practice. A country can declare that it wants greater independence, yet real independence remains limited if it lacks the equipment, trained workers, institutions, financing, and maintenance systems required to solve its own problems. National capacity is therefore not an abstract idea. It is the ability to turn decisions into functioning services. Traore has also promoted the idea that Burkinabe citizens themselves must participate in building the country they want. That message becomes surprisingly relevant to the sanitation story. Government can provide a toilet, workers can clean it, managers can operate it. But citizens still determine whether the facility is respected, protected, and used responsibly. Public development becomes stronger when people stop seeing shared infrastructure as someone else's property. This does not mean every successful project should become evidence that Traore's entire political program is working. Burkina Faso continues to face enormous security, economic, sanitation, and governance challenges. A clean toilet cannot answer those questions. What it can do is provide a small test of a much larger promise. If a government speaks about national renewal, ordinary citizens should eventually be able to identify improvements in their own communities. That may be the fairest way to judge Traore's vision. Not through heroic images or viral claims, but through results that survive after the cameras leave. Can Burkina Faso build more of what it needs, operate those services reliably, and involve citizens in protecting them? If sovereignty is to become more than a political slogan, it must eventually travel from the presidential office all the way down to the street. The sanitation story leads to a larger question about sovereignty. Across Africa, sovereignty is often discussed through military alliances, natural resources, foreign troops, currencies, and relations with former colonial powers such as France. Those issues matter. But political independence means much less if a country remains unable to provide the basic systems its citizens depend on every day. Roads, water, sanitation, healthcare, electricity, and functioning public institutions are also part of national strength. This is where the idea of self-reliance becomes practical. A sovereign country does not need to manufacture every machine or reject every foreign partner. It needs enough domestic capacity to identify its priorities, make its own decisions, negotiate from a stronger position, and maintain essential services over time. A government that builds infrastructure but cannot repair it remains dependent in a different way. The same principle applies whether we are discussing a highway or a public toilet. That distinction is important when considering Ibrahim Traore and the Pan-African message surrounding his leadership. Supporters often see Burkina Faso as part of a broader African effort to reclaim political and economic agency. But Pan-Africanism becomes more meaningful when it moves beyond speeches. It can also mean African countries strengthening their institutions, developing skills, sharing knowledge, trading with one another, and creating solutions suited to the realities of their own communities. Burkina Faso itself demonstrates why this cannot simply mean isolation. The country continues to cooperate with international partners, including UNICEF and Germany, on water and sanitation programs. Such cooperation does not automatically contradict sovereignty. The more useful question is whether partnerships support priorities chosen by Burkina Faso, strengthen local capacity, and leave communities better able to manage essential services after outside assistance ends. For older Africans who remember the independence era, this distinction may sound familiar. Political flags changed across the continent decades ago, yet the harder challenge was building institutions capable of turning independence into better daily life. That work remains unfinished in many places. Sovereignty, therefore, has both a national and a household dimension. It must eventually mean something to the farmer, the worker, the mother, and the elderly man walking through his neighborhood. And that brings us back to our modest public toilet. It cannot carry the weight of Pan-Africanism by itself, but it can illustrate the standard by which grand ideas should be judged. Can African governments solve ordinary problems, maintain what they build, cooperate without surrendering their priorities, and give citizens a meaningful role in protecting public assets? If the answer increasingly becomes yes, then sovereignty is no longer only something declared from a podium. It becomes something people can experience. At this point, a serious question must be asked. Are we looking at genuine change in Burkina Faso, or are ordinary projects being turned into political symbols around Ibrahim Traore? Critics outside Burkina Faso, including Western media and international observers, have challenged the heroic image of Traore that circulates online. Some of that skepticism deserves attention because social media has repeatedly carried exaggerated or poorly verified claims about achievements attributed to his government. There are also problems that no supporter of Traore should simply ignore. Burkina Faso continues to face a severe security crisis. Millions of people still live under difficult economic conditions. The country has not solved its sanitation deficit, and international partners remain involved in important development programs. There are also serious criticisms concerning political freedoms, the media environment, and the direction of military rule. A few visible infrastructure projects cannot erase those questions. But the opposite mistake is equally dangerous. The existence of propaganda does not mean every reported improvement is propaganda. Independent economic evidence provides a more complicated picture. The World Bank estimated that Burkina Faso's economy grew by about 4.9% in 2024, compared with roughly 3% in 2023. Its later assessment estimated real economic growth of about 5.3% in 2025. Agriculture and services were among the important contributors. Those figures should not be turned into another political slogan. Economic growth does not automatically mean prosperity has reached every household. Millions of Burkinabe citizens remain poor, and the World Bank itself has stressed the need to transform economic resilience into jobs and broader opportunities. Growth can be real while hardship remains real at the same time. The same standard should apply to the sanitation story. One clean public toilet does not prove that Traore is right about everything, but criticism of Traore does not make that toilet imaginary either. If residents say a facility has made daily life easier, that result deserves to be examined on its own merits. Evidence should matter more than whether a claim is politically convenient. That may be the most useful response to both Western criticism and exaggerated praise. Do not automatically believe either side. Ask what can actually be verified. Burkina Faso should not be judged through viral images of Ibrahim Traore, nor should its progress be dismissed simply because its government has challenged traditional relationships with France and other Western powers. The stronger approach is to measure roads as roads, sanitation as sanitation, economic performance through credible data, and political governance by its own standards. That is how a serious African development debate should proceed. Burkina Faso's experience offers lessons for other African countries, but the first lesson is not to copy Burkina Faso blindly. Mali under Assimi Goïta, Niger under Abdourahmane Tchiani, and other nations across the Sahel face different economic, security, and social conditions. What can travel across borders is not one political formula, but a more practical question. Does development solve problems that ordinary citizens actually experience? The first lesson is to begin with those problems. A government may announce impressive projects, but their value depends on whether they improve daily life. The second lesson is that construction alone is never enough. Roads require maintenance. Water systems require technicians. Clinics require staff and supplies. Public toilets require cleaning and management. Africa has little to gain from infrastructure that looks impressive on inauguration day but stops working after the cameras disappear. The third lesson concerns citizens themselves. Public property survives when people understand that protecting it protects their own investment. Governments must provide services and enforce reasonable rules, but communities also have responsibilities. The fourth lesson is equally important. Self-reliance should not become isolation. African governments can work with international partners while still defining their own priorities, strengthening local skills, and negotiating relationships that serve national interests. The fifth lesson may be the most important. Development should not be built around the image of one leader. Ibrahim Traore may set priorities in Burkina Faso. Assimi Goïta may influence Mali's direction, and Abdurrahmane Chiani may shape Niger's. But lasting progress requires institutions, engineers, workers, local officials, managers, and citizens who can continue functioning long after any individual leader has left office. That is the larger test for West Africa and the Sahel. The goal should not be to produce another Traore in every capital. It should be to build African states capable of turning sovereignty into reliable services, productive economies, accountable institutions, and improvements people can recognize in their own neighborhoods. A leader can point toward a destination. Only functioning institutions and an engaged population can keep a country moving toward it. And that brings us back to where this story began, with one ordinary citizen, one everyday need, and one surprisingly revealing measure of whether national progress is reaching the ground. And so we return to the woman standing inside a clean public toilet in Ouagadougou. She was not talking about geopolitics, military alliances, the African Union, or the future of the Sahel. She was describing something much simpler. Before finding an appropriate place to relieve herself was difficult. Now there was a clean facility, useful equipment, privacy, and even a mirror where she could check herself before walking back outside. That small mirror should not become propaganda. It does not prove that Burkina Faso has defeated poverty, solved insecurity, or completed its development. It certainly does not prove that every decision made by Ibrahim Traore is correct. But it reminds us that national progress eventually has to leave government offices and political speeches. It has to reach streets, neighborhoods, markets, hospitals, farms, water systems, and the ordinary places where people live their lives. This is why the Burkina Faso story deserves attention beyond the headlines of Africa News. Ibrahim Traore has made sovereignty and national capacity central themes of his leadership, just as Assimi Goïta in Mali and Abdurrahmane Chiani in Niger have challenged older political arrangements across West Africa. Their disagreements with France and other traditional partners have created enormous debate. Yet, the deeper test is not simply who leaves, who stays, or which foreign flag disappears. The real test is what African institutions become capable of doing afterward. For Burkina Faso, that test is still underway. A country seeking greater independence must also build roads, improve sanitation, expand access to water, strengthen healthcare, create productive work, maintain public infrastructure, and protect citizens. It must also accept that cooperation with the outside world does not automatically destroy sovereignty. Genuine independence means having enough capacity and confidence to choose partnerships according to national priorities, rather than treating either dependence or isolation as a permanent destiny. That may be the broader lesson for the African Union and countries across the Sahel. Africa does not need every nation to reproduce Burkina Faso or every capital to search for another Ibrahim Traore. It needs stronger institutions that can survive individual leaders. It needs citizens who protect shared assets, governments that can maintain what they build, and partnerships that strengthen African capacity rather than replace it. Perhaps that is how we should measure this story. Not by asking whether one public toilet proves a revolution, because it does not. Ask instead whether tomorrow brings more practical improvements that ordinary people can see, use, and preserve. If you believe African news should be told from the ground as well as from presidential palaces, follow this channel and share your experience. What small change in your own community first made you feel that your country was genuinely moving forward? We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.